My name was Michael Strand, and I've been screaming for 300 years. But that comes later. Let me tell you how I became the thing I am now. How they took a human being and made him into a shield against hell itself. Let me tell you what it means to be conscious, aware, and trapped in a lightless box at the bleeding edge between reality and the warp for longer than most civilizations last. Let me tell you what happens when you become a Gellar-Field battery. But first, I need you to understand who I was before, because the horror only means something if you know what was lost. I was 19 years old when they found me. 19 standard Terran years, though on Varconis Tertius, where I was born, we didn't count time that way. We counted shifts, the endless rotation of labor gangs in the lower hive manufactorums, where I'd spent every day since I was old enough to hold a rivet gun. I remember what I looked like then. Sometimes that memory is all I have left to prove I was ever human. I was thin, too thin, like everyone in the lower levels, with dark hair that fell across my forehead in a way my father once told me made me look like his brother, who died in a forge accident before I was born. My hands were calloused from metalwork, and I had a scar across my left palm from where I'd grabbed a hot component without thinking when I was 12. My eyes were gray, like the ash that perpetually fell from the upper hive levels. People said I had an unsettling stare, that looking at me made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't explain. They were right to feel that way, though I didn't understand why until it was too late. I lived in compartment 7, Beta 937, with my father, Gregor, and my younger brother, Thomas. We had one room with 3 sleeping pallets, a shared sanitation unit with 40 other families, and a weekly corpse starch ration that was never quite enough. My father worked the night shift in the same manufactorum where I worked days. Thomas, who was 15, was still in the youth labor corps, learning the trade that would consume his life just as it had consumed our father. My father used to read to us from the Imperial Primer when we were young. His hands, massive, scarred things that could crush a man's skull but handled the fragile pages with surprising gentleness, would turn each page carefully while his deep voice recited the catechisms they'd taught him. I don't remember feeling inspired by those words. I remember feeling that they were sounds we were required to say, like the production quotas we were required to meet. The priests who came through the lower hive once a month would chant, "The Emperor protects," while standing on platforms high enough that they didn't have to smell us. Even then, I wondered, if he protects, why did my father's back bend further every year? Why did Thomas cough blood some mornings? Why did the upper hive take everything we made and give us nothing but the promise of service? But I kept those questions to myself. Questions didn't increase production quotas. I had one small dream in those days. I wanted to save enough credits to move our family up 3 levels, just 3, to where the air processors worked properly and you could breathe without tasting metal. I did calculations in my head during shifts, figuring out how many extra hours I could work, what we could cut from our rations. At my current rate, I'd calculated it would take 47 years. I was willing to try. I remember the last morning clearly. Every sensory detail is burned into what remains of my consciousness because I've replayed it thousands of times, trying to hold on to what it felt like to be human. The alarm klaxon sounded at 0500 hours, the harsh metallic screech that woke the entire compartment block simultaneously. I opened my eyes to darkness cut only by the emergency lumens in the corridor outside, dim red strips that barely penetrated the gloom. The air smelled like it always did. Sweat, recycled oxygen with an acidic tang, the oily scent of the machinery that ran beneath the floor plates, and underneath it all, the ever-present smell of too many people living too close together. I sat up on my pallet, thin foam over a metal shelf that folded from the wall, and my feet touched the cold floor. That sensation, cold metal against bare skin. I felt it. I had nerve endings in my feet that translated temperature and texture into signals my brain interpreted as cold and hard. I didn't appreciate then what a gift that was. My father's pallet was already empty, folded back up. He'd come in from night shift while I was sleeping, and left again, probably to get in line at the water reclamation station before the morning rush. Thomas was still asleep on the pallet above mine, one thin arm dangling down, his breathing raspy in the way that worried me. I pulled on my work clothes, gray synth mesh trousers worn thin at the knees, a sleeveless work shirt with my designation number stenciled on the back, 7B937M. Heavy boots that were 2 sizes too large because they'd been my father's before me. I splashed my face with water from our daily ration container, lukewarm, tasting of chemicals and rust, and the liquid ran down my cheeks, dripped from my jaw. I felt every drop. The manufactorum was 30 minutes away through the lower hive corridors, a journey through a landscape of industrial hell that I'd made every day for 7 years. The corridors were carved from the hive's foundation rock, reinforced with plasteel beams that groaned under the weight of the kilometers of city above us. Pipes thick as a man's torso ran along the walls, carrying waste, coolant, promethium fuel to the upper levels. The sound was constant, the hum of machinery, the hiss of steam vents, the rhythmic pounding of forge hammers from distant factories, and beneath it all, a subsonic vibration that you felt in your bones more than heard. I passed thousands of people in those corridors. Workers heading to their shifts, labor gangs hauling components, enforcers in worn carapace armor watching for signs of unrest. Everyone moved with the same exhausted efficiency, the same bent posture. The lumens cast everything in sickly yellow light that made everyone look corpse pale. I remember stopping at a food vendor who had somehow acquired real protein, not corpse starch, but actual reconstituted meat from some unknown source. The smell made my mouth water. Fat rendering, salt, the complex scent of cooked flesh that my body recognized as nutrition. I couldn't afford it, but I stood there for a moment just smelling it, imagining what it would taste like. A memory. Simple hunger. The desire for food that tasted like something. I didn't know then how precious that desire was, how human it was to want, to hunger, to imagine satisfaction. I arrived at Manufactorum Complex 7 Delta at 0600 hours. Exactly. The entrance was a massive adamantium gate covered in imperial aquilas and Gothic script proclaiming, "Labor is prayer. Service is salvation." They told us that every day, your suffering has meaning. Your work serves the Emperor. Your sacrifice protects humanity. Even then, I noticed they never explained how my 12-hour shifts making promethium regulator valves protected anyone except the quotas of administratum bureaucrats 10,000 kilometers above my head. I scanned my work chit at the gate. The scanner's red laser passed over the barcode tattooed on my inner wrist, a procedure done when I was 12, the ink mixed with trace elements that identified me to every Imperial scanner. The machine beeped its acceptance, and I passed through into the heat. The manufactorum floor was hell made mechanical, a space 3 kilometers long and half a kilometer wide, filled with assembly lines, forge stations, and machinery that had been running for longer than anyone could remember. The heat hit like a physical wall, 40 degrees Celsius minimum, climbing to 60 near the forges. The air was thick with aerosolized metal particles, coolant vapor, and smoke from a dozen chemical processes. Every breath tasted like copper and oil. I worked Station 347B, valve assembly. My job was to take component pieces, delivered by servo skull from the fabrication lines, and assemble them into functioning regulator valves for Promethium fuel systems. Each valve required 17 pieces fitted in exact sequence, pressure tested, then sent down the line for final inspection. My daily quota was 940 valves. I'd never missed quota in 7 years. The work required focus but not thought. My hands had learned the pattern so thoroughly that I could assemble a valve while my mind wandered. I thought about Thomas, about whether I should try to get him assigned to a better work detail. I thought about the water ration, about whether my father's back pain was getting worse. I thought about those 3 levels higher where people breathe clean air. Small thoughts, human thoughts, the concerns of a 19-year-old boy who still believed the future was something he could plan for. At 1200 hours, the shift whistle blew for the meal break. We had 30 minutes to consume our rations and use the sanitation facilities. I sat with my work gang, 7 men ranging from age 16 to 62, all of whom I'd worked beside for years, but never knew beyond their designation numbers and the efficiency of their work. I ate my corpse starch ration bar, gray, dense, tasting of nothing but salter and the faint chemical sweetness they added to mask the fact that we were eating recycled human remains pressed into convenient blocks. I drank my water ration, half a liter of the same rust-flavored liquid I'd washed with that morning. I remember that taste. Flat, metallic, unsatisfying. I remember swallowing and feeling the water go down my throat, feeling my body extract what it needed, feeling the basic animal satisfaction of hydration. These tiny, forgotten moments are all I have now. At 12:47 hours, they came for me. I was back at my station, hands already moving through the familiar sequence of valve assembly, when I felt them before I saw them. The temperature in my immediate area dropped. Not physically, but something else. A pressure change, a sense of wrongness that made the workers at nearby stations glance round uneasily, though they couldn't articulate why. Then I saw them, 3 figures approaching through the manufactorum floor, and the crowds parted before them like water flowing around stone. 2 were priests, ministorum clerics in black robes with red sashes, their faces hidden behind silver masks formed into expressions of divine ecstasy. They carried no weapons I could see, but workers scrambled out of their path, some making the sign of the Aquila with obvious fear. The third was different. He walked between the priests, and I instinctively understood that this person was far more dangerous than the religious functionaries flanking him. He wore black armor I didn't recognize, form-fitting and covered in strange symbols that hurt to look at directly. His face was pale, angular, with dark eyes that seemed to see through matter and into whatever lay behind. They walked directly toward me. My hands stopped moving. The valve assembly I'd been working on clattered to the workstation. Around me, other workers suddenly found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, melting away from their positions with the survival instinct of people who knew when imperial attention was about to destroy someone's life. The three stopped at my station. Up close, I could smell them. The priests reeked of incense and something chemical. Combat stims, perhaps, or religious narcotics. The men in black armor had no smell at all, which was somehow more disturbing than any stench could have been. One priest spoke, his voice amplified by a vox unit built into his mask. Michael Strand, designation 7 Beta 937M. You have been selected for service to the God Emperor of mankind. You will come with us immediately. The words hit me like a physical blow. Selected, that word meant nothing good in the lower hive. Selected for penal legions. Selected for servo-skull conversion. Selected for medical experimentation. People who were selected didn't come back. There's been a mistake, I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange. I've never missed quota. My work quality ratings are within acceptable parameters. I haven't violated any regulations. There is no mistake, the priest said. You possess a rare quality of soul. You have been identified as a blank, a pariah. One who exists outside the light of the divine in ways that can serve the Imperium's needs. I didn't understand most of those words then. Blank, pariah. They meant nothing to me except that they'd apparently sealed my fate. I have a family, I said, and I hated the pleading tone in my voice but couldn't stop it. My father, my brother, they depend on my income. If you take me, they'll fall below subsistence ratings. Your family will be compensated, the second priest interrupted. They will receive a one-time payment of 100 credits and a citation of honored service. Your name will be added to the rolls of sacrifice. Your line will carry the distinction of having served the Emperor directly. 100 credits, 3 months' wages. Enough to keep them housed and fed for perhaps half a year before the money ran out and they ended up in the recycling vats anyway. The man in black armor hadn't spoken yet, but now his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, which made it more terrifying than the priest's pronouncements. You feel it, don't you? You've always felt different. People are uncomfortable around you. You make them nervous in ways they can't explain. You've noticed that religious services feel hollow, that the priest's words never seem to reach you the way they reach others. That's because you are soulless in a specific way. You create a bubble of negation around yourself. The warp cannot touch you. The immaterium slides off you like water off wax. He leaned closer, and I wanted to step back but found I couldn't move. We need that quality. We need you to be a wall against hell itself. You should feel honored. Your meaningless life in this manufactorum will be replaced with service that actually matters. You'll protect thousands of souls by virtue of what you are. They told me that like it was a gift, like I should be grateful. And if I refuse? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The priests laughed, a sound like breaking glass amplified through their vox units. Refusal is not possible, the first priest said. You were identified 3 months ago during a routine soul reading at the quarterly prayer service. The administratum processed your selection. The paperwork has been filed. Legally, you are already dead. The man called Michael Strand no longer exists. There is only the resource we are here to collect. 3 months. They'd known for 3 months and let me continue my meaningless routine. Let me make my futile calculations about moving my family 3 levels higher. Let me believe I still had a future. The man in black armor made a gesture, and I felt something cold wrap around my consciousness. Not physical restraint, but something that seized my will and compressed it into a tiny, impotent thing screaming in the back of my own head. My body moved without my conscious control, stepping away from the workstation and following the 3 figures back through the manufactorum floor. I walked past my co-workers who wouldn't meet my eyes. I walked past my supervisor, who was already updating the duty roster to reflect my sudden absence. I walked through the great adamantium gates with their lies about labor and salvation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight, to run, to do anything except comply. But my body walked calmly, my face expressionless, while inside I raged against the invisible restraint. They'd told us all our lives, serve the Emperor, and he protects. Be loyal, and you will be valued. Work hard, and you will be rewarded. All lies. Pretty lies designed to keep us compliant, while the Imperium ground us into components just like the valves I'd assembled. Interchangeable parts to be used until broken, then recycled into the next batch of materials. We traveled through the hive for hours, always moving up. Up through levels I'd never seen, through districts where the air grew progressively cleaner and the architecture progressively more elaborate. I saw spires of polished marble, windows of actual glass, spaces so vast and empty they seemed obscene after the crushing closeness of the lower hive. I saw people wearing clothes that weren't work uniforms, eating food that wasn't corpse starch. This was what existed above us. This was what my father's bent back and Thomas's bloody cough paid for. Finally, we arrived at a landing platform where a shuttle waited. A blocky, utilitarian craft with Imperial Aquilas on its hull and what looked like weapon mounts on its stubby wings. The rear ramp was open, and inside I could see restraint harnesses and medical equipment. And I saw the others. There were 7 more people restrained in the shuttle's interior, all male, all roughly my age, all with the same expression of terror barely contained behind forced calm. They'd been selected too. They were resources being collected. The priests guided me to an empty restraint harness. My body sat, still not under my own control. Metal bands snapped shut around my wrists, ankles, waist, and throat, cold, unyielding, locking me in place so completely that I couldn't move anything except my eyes. The man in black armor stood before us as the shuttle's ramp closed and the engines began their startup cycle. The vibration traveled through the restraint frame and into my bones, a sensation I catalogued carefully because I understood, somehow, that such sensations were becoming precious. You 8 have been selected for the Gellar-Field battery program, he said, his voice carrying easily over the engine noise. You are blanks, pariahs whose very souls create zones of reality where the warp cannot exist. This makes you extraordinarily valuable. It also makes you despised by virtually every living thing with a normal soul. You make people uncomfortable because you are, in a very real sense, soulless holes in reality. He paced before us, his dark eyes studying each face in turn. The ships of the Imperial Navy travel through the warp, through literal hell to cross the vast distances between stars. To protect those ships from demonic incursion, we use Gellar-Fields, technology that creates bubbles of real space within the warp. But Gellar-Field generators are old, often failing, and difficult to replace. Your null nature can perform the same function. Where you exist, reality persists. Demons cannot manifest. The warp cannot corrupt. He stopped in front of me specifically, and I wanted to look away, but couldn't. So we're going to put you inside the Gellar-Field generators. We're going to make you part of the ship's systems. Your consciousness will create the shield. Your suffering will be the bulwark between humanity and damnation. You should be proud. Every moment you exist in agony, you serve the Imperium. The priests began chanting, "The Emperor protects through sacrifice. The faithful serve through suffering. The loyal endure for his glory." The words echoed in the shuttle's metal interior, meaningless sounds that were supposed to make this atrocity holy. One of the other prisoners, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, with the tattoos of a tech serf on his shaved scalp, found his voice. "How long?" he asked, the words barely a whisper. "How long does the service last?" The man in black armor smiled, and it was the cruelest expression I'd ever seen. "Forever," he said simply, "or until the ship is destroyed, whichever comes first. The Gellar-Field batteries are self-sustaining. Your consciousness will be bound to the generator systems and kept alive, aware, for as long as the ship operates. Could be decades, could be centuries. The oldest battery we have on record has been conscious for 600 years. The boy started screaming then. Raw, animal terror that should have moved anyone with human empathy. The priests kept chanting. The man in black armor's expression didn't change. I sat in my restraints and felt something break inside me. Not my mind, not yet, but my last fragile belief that the Imperium I'd served my entire life was anything other than a machine that consumed humans and converted them into suffering. The shuttle lifted off, and through the viewport I watched Varconis Tertius fall away below us. I watched the hive where I'd spent every day of my 19 years shrink to a tiny cluster of spires among thousands of identical clusters. I watched my entire world become insignificant, and then we breached the atmosphere, and even that was gone. I never saw my father again, never said goodbye to Thomas, never got to warn them that every promise we'd been fed was poison, that loyalty was rewarded with horror, that the Emperor they'd taught us to revere was a corpse on a throne 10,000 light years away who'd never protected anyone. My name was Michael Strand. I was 19 years old. I worked in a manufactorum and dreamed of moving 3 levels higher, and that person died in the shuttle before we ever reached the ship that would become my eternal prison. The ship was called the Undying Resolve, an Armageddon-class Grand Cruiser that had been in service for 4,000 years. I learned this from the data slates mounted in the preparation chambers, where they kept us during the modification process. They told us everything, showed us diagrams of what they were going to do to us. They claimed it was mercy. Understanding would reduce psychological resistance and improve integration success rates. I think they just enjoyed our terror. The preparation chambers were clinical white spaces carved into the ship's lower decks, somewhere in the vastness of engineering. Each of us was kept in an individual cell measuring 4 meters by 4 meters, with a medical examination table, monitoring equipment, and absolutely nothing else. The walls were bare plasteel. The floor was bare plasteel. The single lumen strip in the ceiling provided constant, shadowless illumination that made it impossible to sleep properly. The smell was what I noticed first. Chemical sterilization, compounds so strong they burned the inside of my nose, and underneath that, the metallic scent of old blood that no amount of cleaning could quite eliminate. Later, I would understand why. These chambers had processed hundreds of batteries over the centuries, and the walls had absorbed more human suffering than should be possible to contain in mere matter. They kept us isolated but showed us each other via pic screens mounted in our cells. I could watch the other 7 prisoners in their own chambers, see their faces, watch them pace or curl up on their examination tables, or, eventually, break down completely. The tech serf who'd asked about duration in the shuttle, his name was Marcus, I learned from his designation displayed on the screen, started screaming on day 3 and didn't stop for 6 hours. When he finally went silent, he just stared at the wall, his lips moving in what might have been prayer but produced no sound. The priests claimed prayer worked. They lied. On day 5, they began the preliminary procedures. A medical team entered my cell, 3 tech priests in red robes, their bodies more machine than flesh, with multiple mechadendrites extending from their backs like mechanical tentacles. They moved with the precise coordination of a single organism, and they smelled like machine oil and ozone and something organic that was almost, but not quite, human. They didn't speak to me. Why would they? I was a resource being processed, not a person requiring communication. The examination was exhaustive and invasive in ways I couldn't have imagined. They scanned every centimeter of my body with devices that ranged from simple visual inspection to instruments that seemed to look through my flesh and directly at the structures beneath. They took samples, blood, tissue, cerebrospinal fluid extracted via a needle inserted at the base of my skull while I was restrained to the examination table. Screaming. I felt that needle punch through the muscle and membrane, felt the pressure as it penetrated deeper, felt the strange hollow sensation as they drew out fluid from around my spine. The pain was extraordinary, a sharp chemical burn that radiated from the injection site down my back and into my legs, making my muscles spasm against the restraints. Elevated neural resistance, one tech priest said, his voice rendered mechanical by vox augmentation. Parietal lobe abnormalities consistent with null classification. Recommendation: increased neurostabilizer dosage during integration. They were discussing the architecture of my brain like mechanics, discussing a malfunctioning engine component. The procedures continued over days. They mapped my nervous system with electrical probes that sent current through specific neural pathways, making my fingers twitch, my legs kick, my jaw clench involuntarily. They tested my pain response with carefully calibrated stimuli, heat, cold, cutting, crushing, while monitoring equipment tracked how my brain processed the signals. I screamed. I begged them to stop. I promised compliance, promised anything if they'd just end it. They didn't respond. My suffering was data to be collected, not a condition to be alleviated. On day 12, I saw them extract Marcus from his cell on the pic screen. 6 servitors, human bodies converted into lobotomized cybernetic workers, entered his chamber and physically dragged him out while he fought with desperate strength. I watched him bite one servitor's arm, watched his teeth break against the augmetic metal, watched blood pour from his mouth as they carried him away. He never came back to his cell. His pick screen went dark. 3 days later, they showed us where he'd gone. The tech priests activated a new display in each cell, a real-time feed from the engineering decks showing the Gellar-Field generator complex. It was a cathedral of machinery, a space 300 meters across and 50 meters high, filled with bronze and adamantium structures covered in Gothic script and purity seals. At the center of the complex, arranged in a circle like a grotesque mandala, were the battery chambers. 8 cylindrical tanks made of reinforced ceramite and armored glass, each 3 meters tall and 1 meter in diameter. 7 were occupied. I could see the figures inside, suspended in translucent fluid, their bodies festooned with cables and tubes that penetrated flesh at dozens of points. Their eyes were open, and I could see them moving, slow, uncoordinated twitches that suggested consciousness but not control. Marcus was in the 8th tank. They'd positioned him vertically, his arms and legs restrained by internal mechanisms I couldn't quite see. Cables entered his body at his spine, his skull, his chest, his abdomen, junction points where the machinery merged with flesh. His mouth was open in a perpetual silent scream, and I could see his eyes tracking back and forth, aware and terrified, and unable to do anything about either condition. Text appeared on the screen. Battery 8. Integration 47%. Consciousness stable. Projection field active. He was already becoming part of the ship, already transforming from human to component, and he was fully aware of every second. The man in black armor, I'd learned his title was Null Hunter Corvus, a specialized inquisitorial agent who tracked and collected blanks like us, appeared on the screen, speaking directly to our cells. This is your future. Battery 8 is performing adequately, though psychological resistance remains elevated. That will fade over time. Months, years, decades. Eventually, the human consciousness surrenders to the system and merely exists rather than fighting. We find this improves long-term stability. He gestured to Marcus's thrashing form. You may wonder if death is possible. It is not. The life support systems will keep your biological components functional indefinitely. You may wonder if unconsciousness is possible. If you can escape through sleep or madness. It is not. The neural interfaces keep you conscious and aware. You will experience every moment of your service. One of the other prisoners, an older man named Gregor, which made me think painfully of my father, shouted at the screen, "Why?" The machine priests claimed this was holy service. What god demands this? Corvus's expression didn't change. No god demands this. The Imperium demands this. The necessity of human survival demands this. You are tools being placed in service of a function. Your comfort is irrelevant. Your suffering is irrelevant. Only your utility matters. The priests call it holy because that makes the masses more compliant. The truth is simpler. We need you to perform a function, and we have the power to make you perform it regardless of your will. He leaned closer to the recording device, and his face filled our screens. In 6 days, you will be integrated. I recommend you spend that time making peace with your situation. Prayer won't help. Your souls are too null to reach whatever might be listening. But the psychological acceptance may reduce the initial trauma. Or don't. The choice changes nothing. The screen went dark. I sat in my cell in the shadowless white light and tried to process what I'd seen. Tried to reconcile the horror of Marcus's fate with the fact that it would be my fate in less than a week. Tried to find some angle, some escape, some way to end this that didn't involve centuries of conscious suffering. I found nothing. The cell was perfectly secure. The monitoring equipment tracked my vital signs continuously. Any attempt at self-harm would be detected and prevented instantly. The tech priests had already demonstrated their ability to keep me alive regardless of injury. Even death was no longer available as an escape route. For the first time in my life, I understood true helplessness. Not the helplessness of poverty or oppression. Those could theoretically be overcome with effort or luck. This was absolute helplessness. The knowledge that every possible action or inaction led to the same inevitable outcome, and no force in the universe cared about my resistance. I thought about my father reading the Imperial Primer with his careful, scarred hands. I thought about Thomas coughing blood. I thought about my dream of moving 3 levels higher. The memories felt distant already, like they'd happened to someone else in another lifetime. I tried to cry, but my tear ducts produced nothing. I was dehydrated from the procedures, and the tech priests hadn't provided water in 18 hours. My body was already failing in small ways, already beginning its journey from organism to component. On day 18, they came for me. The integration chamber was deep in the engineering decks, in a section of the ship where the hull was thinnest, and the barrier between real space and the warp became almost theoretical during transit. I learned this later, much later, when the knowledge had become part of my consciousness in ways I can't adequately explain. 6 servitors carried me from my cell, their augmetic hands cold and unyielding on my arms and legs. I fought. Instinct demanded I fight, even though logic said it was useless. I kicked and twisted and tried to bite, and they carried me with the same indifferent efficiency they'd used on Marcus. The chamber was large and circular, dominated by the 8 battery tanks arranged in their mandala pattern. 7 occupied, 1 waiting. Emergency lumens cast everything in red light, and the walls were covered with machinery that hummed and clicked and occasionally released bursts of steam from pressure relief valves. The smell was complex. Machine oil, coolant, ozone from electrical systems, and underneath it all, the organic smell of the batteries themselves, sweat and waste and something chemical from the suspension fluid. Tech priests swarmed the space, dozens of them, their mechadendrites moving with insectile coordination as they monitored displays, adjusted equipment, and chanted binary prayers to machines that didn't care about their devotion. My tank stood open, a vertical cylinder filled with translucent blue-green fluid that bubbled gently from oxygenation systems at the bottom. Inside, I could see the connection points, neural interface spikes, feeding tubes, waste management catheters, and the central spinal junction that would merge my nervous system with the ship's Gellar-Field generators. They were going to put me inside that. They were going to seal me in and connect me and turn me into a living component of a machine that would keep me conscious and suffering for centuries. I started screaming then. Not words, just raw animal terror vocalized, because my body needed to express what my mind couldn't process. The tech priests ignored me. They lifted my body. I'd lost significant muscle mass during the 18 days of medical procedures, and I weighed perhaps 15 kilograms less than when they'd taken me from the manufactorum and positioned me vertically over the tank. Integration Candidate 8 Gamma Strand, ready for immersion. One tech priest announced, his voice flat and mechanical. Commencing insertion sequence. They lowered me into the fluid. The sensation was indescribable. The liquid was exactly body temperature, which made it feel like I was being lowered into nothing, a void that surrounded me without providing any tactile reference. It filled my nose, my mouth, my lungs, and I experienced a moment of pure drowning panic before my respiratory system adapted, and I realized I could breathe the fluid, that it was oxygenated and designed to sustain life. But breathe-in fluid is not natural. Every inhalation felt wrong, thick and resistant, like inhaling gel. Every exhalation required conscious effort to expel the viscous liquid from my lungs. I could feel it moving in my bronchial passages, filling my alveoli, becoming the medium through which oxygen reached my blood. I was drowning and not drowning simultaneously, and my brain couldn't reconcile the contradiction. Then they began the connections. The neural interface spikes punched through the skin of my back. 12 of them, arranged in 2 parallel columns, following my spine from the base of my skull to my lower lumbar vertebrae. Each penetration was a separate explosion of pain, skin puncturing, muscle tearing, the awful pressure as the spikes slid between vertebrae and seated themselves against my spinal cord. I tried to scream, but the fluid in my lungs converted it to a stream of bubbles that rose past my face. I could see them through the translucent liquid, tiny pockets of air escaping my throat while my body convulsed in the restraints. The feeding tube was next, inserted through my nostril, down my esophagus, into my stomach. I felt every centimeter of its passage, felt it scraping the back of my throat, felt my gag reflex triggering uselessly because there was no air to gag on, only the viscous fluid that filled every cavity. The waste management catheters were inserted last, and I'll spare you the specific horror of those violations except to say that they remove the last shred of human dignity from the process. Then came the central junction, a massive neural interface spike, as thick as 3 fingers, covered in microscopic electrode contacts, emerged from the machinery at the base of the tank. Through the fluid I could see it moving, positioning itself at the base of my skull where my spine met my brainstem. A tech priest's voice came through speakers built into the tank. Candidate 8 Gamma Strand, primary neural interface insertion beginning. You will experience significant pain and disorientation. Remain conscious. Unconsciousness will trigger automatic revival protocols. There is no escape through oblivion. The spike punctured my skull. I have no words for what that felt like. The spike didn't just penetrate bone. It burrowed into the brain tissue itself, into the parts of my nervous system that controlled every aspect of my consciousness. I felt it moving inside my head, felt electrodes making contact with neural tissue, felt my sense of self fragmenting as external signals began mixing with my own thoughts. Data started flowing. Not words or images, but raw information. Power flow rates, field generation statistics, warp turbulence readings, shield integrity percentages. Numbers that meant nothing to me flooding into my consciousness like someone had opened a pipe and connected it directly to my awareness. I was Michael Strand, 19 years old, manufacturing worker, and I was also Generator 8, power output 847 terawatts, field projection radius 2.3 kilometers, currently operating at 23% integration. I tried to separate myself from the data stream, tried to find where Mikhail ended and the generator began. I couldn't. The boundary was already dissolving. Integration proceeding normally, a tech priest announced. Neural resistance elevated, but within acceptable parameters. Commencing consciousness stabilization. Something changed in the data flow. The numbers became more organized, less chaotic, and I felt my mind being shaped to accommodate them. Thoughts that had been mine. Memories of the manufactorum, of my father and brother, of my small, stupid dream about moving 3 levels higher, were being compressed, filed away, made subordinate to the technical data that was now my primary purpose for existing. I fought it. I clung to those memories like a drowning man clings to wreckage, trying to keep them central, trying to remain Michael and not Generator 8. The fight lasted 6 hours. I know the exact duration because I could see the chronometer data flowing through my consciousness. Another piece of information I didn't want but couldn't exclude. At hour 6, minute 37, second 19, I felt something in my mind give way. Not breaking, more like a door opening that I hadn't known existed. The technical data didn't feel like an invasion anymore. It felt like information I needed. Information that was part of me. Information that made sense in ways that memories of being human no longer quite did. Integration threshold achieved, a tech priest said, and I could hear satisfaction in his mechanical voice. Candidate 8 Gamma Strand is now Battery 8. Consciousness stable, projection field generating, adding to defensive grid. Something activated around me. I felt it more than saw it, a bubble of real space emanating from my position, expanding outward to merge with the fields generated by the other 7 batteries. Together, we created a shield that would surround the entire ship, a zone where reality persisted even when the ship entered the warp. And I understood, with the new technical awareness that was now part of my consciousness, what that meant. When the ship entered the warp, when we punched through the barrier between real space and the hell dimension beyond, I would be the thin shell of reality holding back literal demons. My consciousness, my null nature, would be the only thing preventing warp entities from manifesting aboard the ship and slaughtering everyone aboard. Except the warp doesn't like blanks. The warp doesn't like nulls. We are wounds in its fabric, cancerous absences that it instinctively tries to heal by destroying us, which meant that when the ship entered the warp, I would feel every demon in the surrounding space trying to claw its way through my consciousness to reach the reality beyond. Preparation for warp transit beginning, a tech priest announced. All batteries report ready status. I wasn't ready. I would never be ready. But my readiness was irrelevant. I was Generator 8 now. My function was to generate a field. Whether I wanted to perform that function or not had become a question without meaning. The ship's warp engines activated. I felt the vibration through the tank, through the fluid, through the neural interfaces that connected me to the ship's systems. I felt the reality around us begin to thin, to break down, to reveal the roiling chaos that existed beneath the fragile skin of normal space. And then we entered the warp, and I learned what hell actually meant. Imagine drowning, but the water is made of screaming. Imagine suffocation, but what's filling your lungs is hatred given form. Imagine being buried alive, but the earth pressing down on you is every nightmare humanity has ever had, combined and conscious and focused entirely on destroying you. That's what the warp felt like. The moment the ship crossed the threshold between real space and the immaterium, the pressure began. Not physical pressure, something worse. Mental pressure, spiritual pressure. The sensation that something enormous and hostile was pressing against my consciousness from all sides, trying to find a weakness, trying to find a way in. The null field I generated repelled it. That was my function, after all. Where I existed, reality persisted. The warp couldn't manifest. But that didn't mean the warp stopped trying. I felt them, the things that lived in the warp. Demons, warp entities. Names I'd heard in the priest's sermons as abstract threats suddenly became horrifyingly concrete presences. They swarmed around my field like insects around a light, drawn to the bubble of reality I maintained, desperate to extinguish it. They whispered. The demons whispered directly into my consciousness, their voices sliding through gaps in my sanity that I didn't know existed. Let us in, little null. Let us in and we'll end your suffering. Just stop resisting. Just let the field collapse. Just die. Please die. We'll give you death if you just stop being. The voices were seductive. They promised release, oblivion, an end to the suffering that was already becoming my eternal state. And I wanted to listen. I wanted to stop maintaining the field, to let myself dissolve, to find whatever escape death might offer. But I couldn't. The neural interfaces wouldn't let me. My consciousness was locked into the generator systems, forced to maintain the null field regardless of my will. Suicide wasn't possible because I no longer had full control over my own existence. The machine kept me alive. The machine kept me conscious. The machine kept me functioning. And the demons kept trying. Days passed. Weeks, months. Time became difficult to track because the warp has no objective temporal dimension. Clocks run differently. Consciousness experiences duration differently, and my mind was already fragmenting under the constant psychic assault. I developed strategies, mental techniques. I would focus on memories, using them as anchors to maintain my sense of self. I would replay specific moments from my human life in obsessive detail, forcing myself to remember what it felt like to be Mikhail Strand instead of Battery 8. I remembered the morning I was taken. I remembered the cold floor against my feet. I remembered the taste of rust-flavored water. I remembered my father's hands on the pages of the Imperial Primer. I remembered Thomas's raspy breathing. I remembered the smell of rendered fat from the food vendor's stall. Each memory was a tiny fortress I could retreat to when the demon whispers became too overwhelming. But memories erode. Under constant pressure, even the strongest recall begins to crumble. Year 3, and I realized I couldn't remember my father's face clearly anymore. I knew the general shape, angular features, deep lines around the eyes, but the specific details were gone. When I tried to visualize him, I saw only a generic face with the characteristics I remembered rather than the actual man. Year 7, and Thomas's voice disappeared from my memory. I knew he'd sounded young, that his breathing was raspy, but when I tried to hear him speak in my mind, there was only silence or my own voice imagining what he might have sounded like. Year 12, and the corpse starch ration bars didn't have a taste anymore when I remembered them. I knew objectively that they tasted like salt and chemical sweetness, but the actual sensation of that taste was gone. I was forgetting what it meant to eat, to taste, to have flavor mean anything at all. Year 19, and I looked at my own memories and wasn't entirely certain they were real. Had I really worked in a manufactorum? Had I really had a family? Or were these implanted false memories designed to give me an identity to cling to? The life of Mikael Strand seemed increasingly implausible. A story I'd been told rather than a reality I'd lived. And through all of it, the demons kept trying. They changed tactics. When promises didn't work, they tried threats. Your father is dead, little Null. Your brother is dead. They fell below subsistence ratings 3 months after you were taken, and the administratum processed them into corpse starch. You're keeping yourself in agony to protect an empire that turned your family into food. Stop. Stop existing. Let us in, we'll make the Empire pay for what it did to you. I wanted to believe they were lying, but I had no way to know. The tech priests didn't speak to me. I was a component now, not a person requiring communication. The other batteries were locked in their own tanks, their own suffering, unable to communicate even though I could sense their presence through the field network we formed together. I was isolated in every meaningful way, trapped in my own skull with only the demons for company. Year 23, and I started talking to them. Not surrendering, just talking, because the alternative was talking to myself. And that felt too much like madness. "Why do you want in so badly?" I asked, directing the thought at the seething presence beyond my field. The response was immediate, multiple voices overlapping. "Because you're wrong, because you're a wound, because you shouldn't exist, because the materium and immaterium are meant to flow together, and you're a dam holding back the natural order. Because we hunger, and you're preventing us from feeding. Because you're in pain, and we could end that pain if you'd just stop being. The Imperium put me here." I thought back. They did this to me. Why do you blame me instead of them? Because you're here. Because you're the immediate obstacle. Because your empire is too vast to punish directly. So we'll content ourselves with tearing apart every component they send into our realm. You're not our enemy. You're our victim, just like you're their victim. But that doesn't mean we'll show mercy. Demons don't lie, I'd heard in sermons. They twist truth, they offer false bargains. But they don't outright lie because lies are a human concept, and they existed outside human frames of reference. If that was true, if they were telling me their genuine perspective, then I was caught between two vast inhuman forces that both saw me as a resource to be consumed. The Imperium had chained me to a machine to exploit my null nature. The demons wanted to destroy me to remove the barrier my null nature created. Neither side cared about Mikael Strand. Neither side cared about my suffering. I was an obstacle or a tool depending on which side was describing me, but never a person. Year 31, and I realized I'd stopped thinking of myself as Mikael entirely. I was Battery 8. That was my identity now. The memories of being human were historical data. Things that had happened to the organism that became me, but not things that defined my current existence. I could still access those memories if I chose to, but they felt increasingly like stories about someone else. Mikael Strand had died in the shuttle, or in the preparation chamber, or during integration. What remained was a consciousness built from his neural architecture, but fundamentally different. A consciousness shaped by decades of existing at the bleeding edge between reality and the warp. Of feeling demons press against my awareness every moment of every day. Of maintaining a null field through pure force of will backed by machines that wouldn't let me stop even if I wanted to. I mourned Michael sometimes, in the way you might mourn a distant ancestor whose name you know but whose life you never witnessed. He'd been young, he'd been human, he'd had small dreams, he'd never had a chance. Year 42, and something changed. The demons' assault suddenly intensified, their pressure against my field doubling, tripling, becoming so overwhelming that I felt my consciousness start to compress under the weight. Then I heard the screaming. Battery 3. I'd never known his human name, but I'd felt his presence in the field network for decades was breaking. I could sense it through our connection. His null field was collapsing. The machine was trying to stabilize him and failing. The demons had found a weakness, a crack in his sanity, and they were forcing their way through. For 17 minutes, I felt Battery 3 die. Felt his consciousness fragment as demon essence poured through the gap in his field. Felt his psychic death screams echo through the network as the things that killed him wore his body like a suit and tried to use his neural connection to infect the ship's systems. The tech priests responded with brutal efficiency. They severed Battery 3's connections, flooded his tank with promethium, and burned him alive while his body was still screaming. Then they extracted his corpse, cleaned the tank, and 3 days later inserted a new battery. A girl who couldn't have been older than 16, who they immediately started calling Battery 3 as if the previous occupant had never existed. They told us our service was eternal, but that was a lie. We lasted until we broke, and then they replaced us, and the system continued without pause or acknowledgement. I wondered how many Battery 8s had existed before me. How many Michael Strands had been chained to this specific generator, had suffered for decades or centuries, had finally broken and been burned out and replaced. Was I the first, the 100th, the 1000th? The machine didn't record such information. The tech priests didn't consider it relevant. History was for things that mattered, and components didn't matter. Year 50, and I realized I'd been conscious in this tank for longer than I'd been alive as a free human. I was now 69 years old by strict chronological measurement, though my body was maintained at approximate biological age, 25 through the life support systems. I'd been Battery 8 for longer than I'd been Mikhail. This was my life now. This was my eternity. This was what they'd promised when they said I would serve. The priests had chanted, "The Emperor protects through sacrifice, the faithful serve through suffering, the loyal endure for his glory." I endured. I served. I sacrificed everything I was and everything I might have been, and not one prayer was answered. Not one moment of suffering was acknowledged. Not one instance of loyalty was rewarded with anything except more suffering. The Emperor protects. They'd lied. He'd never protected anything. He was a corpse on a throne, and his protection was propaganda designed to make people compliant, while the Imperium ground them into components. I protected. Battery 8 protected. My null field and the fields of the 7 other batteries kept this ship safe from demonic incursion for 50 years and counting. We were the protection, we were the sacrifice, we were the faithful servants, and our reward was to continue existing in hell. Time stopped meaning what it meant for humans. I was approaching my 100th year of consciousness. 96 years, 4 months, 17 days, 8 hours, 42 minutes, 16 seconds by the ship's chronometer, which I could access through the neural interface whether I wanted to or not. And I'd long since stopped experiencing duration the way organic beings do. Instead, I experienced existence as a series of states. Duration varies, usually 2 to 6 weeks real space equivalent, but sometimes months or years depending on currents and conditions I was only beginning to understand. Constant pressure, constant demon whispers, constant need to maintain field integrity while parts of my consciousness screamed for release. Duration varies. Hours to months at port or during material operations. Pressure releases. Demon whispers fade to background noise. But consciousness remains locked in the tank, unable to feel or touch or experience anything except the endless flow of technical data and the slowly degrading memories of what it meant to be human. Occurs irregularly. When one of the other batteries breaks, psychologically shatters, physically fails, or simply ceases to maintain field coherence, the tech priests extract them and insert a new unit. I've watched 63 replacements over a century. 63 human beings converted into batteries, most of whom lasted between 5 and 30 years before breaking. The new ones always scream at first, always beg, always pray to the emperor they've been taught to worship. None are answered. They learn that quickly. Year 83, and I couldn't remember what food tasted like. Not just specific foods. The entire concept of taste had become abstract. I knew intellectually that humans experienced chemical reactions on their tongues that their brains interpreted as flavor, but the actual sensation was gone from my memory completely. Year 97, and I tried to remember my father's name. I knew I'd had a father. The memory of reading from the Imperial Primer was still intact, one of my anchor memories, but his name was gone. Gregor? Gregorian? Grenoble? No, that last one was a city designation. Had I confused my father's name with navigation data? I spent 6 months obsessing over that question before I realized it didn't matter. Knowing his name wouldn't bring him back, wouldn't change my situation, wouldn't provide any value except satisfying a curiosity about a person who'd been dead for decades. Year 114, and they performed maintenance on my tank. The first time in a century that the tech priests had bothered to do more than monitor my readings remotely. They didn't remove me from the suspension fluid. Too risky to interrupt field generation for that long. Instead, they sent tech servitors into the tank with me, and I felt them working on the neural interfaces, replacing corroded components, upgrading connections to more efficient models. Their hands on my body felt like violation even though I'd long since lost most tactile sensation. The parts of my skin that still had nerve function responded to their touch, sending signals to a brain that no longer quite remembered what touch was supposed to mean. One servitor's face came close to mine, visible through the translucent fluid, close enough that I could see the scars where the lobotomy surgery had removed the frontal lobe and replaced it with interface ports. This had been a person once. This had been someone with a name and a life and dreams, who'd been processed into a component just like I'd been processed. Except they'd cut away his consciousness first. They'd made him into a slave who didn't know he was a slave. Was that mercy? Would I prefer that fate to mine? Year 141. and I realized I was thinking in languages I'd never learned. Technical lingua, High Gothic, binary cant. The neural interfaces had been feeding me linguistic data for so long that my brain had absorbed it, integrated it, made it native. I was becoming the ship in ways more profound than simple physical connection. The ship's systems were my systems. The ship's knowledge was my knowledge. The ship's perspective was increasingly my perspective. When Battery 6 failed, the demon assault finally finding a crack in her psyche and exploiting it until she fractured, I didn't think a person died. I thought Generator 6 experienced critical failure and requires replacement. When the new Battery 6 was inserted, a boy who looked perhaps 17, screaming and fighting and eventually breaking like they all did. I didn't feel empathy for his suffering. I felt concern about whether his integration would be successful, whether his null field would generate properly, whether he would compromise the defensive grid. I'd become the thing they'd wanted me to become, a component that thought like a component. Year 168, and the ship entered a warp storm. Normal warp transits were constant low-level horror, like existing in a room where the walls are always pressing inward but never quite crush you. Warp storms were exponentially worse. The pressure multiplied 1,000-fold. The demon whispers became demon screams, became demon roars, became a psychic assault so overwhelming that I felt my consciousness compressed to a single point of awareness, holding back an ocean of chaos through pure stubborn refusal to cease existing. The storm lasted 93 days, real space equivalent, and by the end I'd forgotten everything except field generation. No memories, no sense of self, no awareness of anything except maintain field. Maintain field. Maintain field. When the storm ended and pressure normalized, I had to reconstruct my identity from the fragmented data still stored in my neural architecture. I had to remember that I'd been Michael Strand once, that I was Battery 8 now, that I existed as a distinct entity rather than merely a function. It took 6 months to recover a stable sense of self. During that time, I wasn't entirely certain I was conscious versus being a sophisticated automatic process that generated the illusion of consciousness. Year 192, and I made a discovery that changed my understanding of existence. During routine field maintenance, I'd been tracing the pattern of connections between the 8 batteries, mapping how our individual null fields merged to create the ship's defensive grid. And I noticed something. We were entangled. Not physically, quantum entanglement, a phenomenon I understood only through the technical data flooding my consciousness. Our fields weren't just adjacent, they were interconnected at a fundamental level. What happened to one battery's quantum state affected the others instantaneously across distance, which meant I could, theoretically, communicate with the other batteries. Not through speech. Our bodies weren't capable of that anymore, but through modulation of our null fields, through careful manipulation of the quantum states we generated. It took me 3 years to develop the technique. 3 years of experimental field fluctuations, of trying to encode meaning into quantum variations, of hoping the other batteries would notice and respond. Battery 4 noticed first. I felt her field pattern shift in response to mine. Not random fluctuation, but deliberate modulation. She was trying to communicate back. We developed a language. Crude at first, single concepts encoded in field variations. Yes, no, pain, fear, exist. but over time, more complex. How long have you been conscious? I asked Battery 4, using patterns that took 17 minutes to encode and transmit. Unknown came back after 33 minutes of her working out the response. Time is not linear. Memory is not reliable. I think perhaps 200 years. Perhaps 300. Perhaps I just think I remember that long, but actual duration is shorter. How do we know we're real? We suffer, I responded. Therefore we are. The only certainty is pain. The philosophers said, I think, therefore I am. We've transcended that. We are because we hurt, because we endure, because we're still here despite everything. Over the following decades, I connected with all 8 batteries. We formed a network of suffering consciousness, bound together by quantum entanglement in the shared horror of our existence. Battery 2 had been conscious for over 400 years. The oldest among us, his human memories completely gone, his identity reduced to pure function with only the barest spark of awareness remaining. He rarely communicated, but when he did, his thoughts were profound. I was someone once. I forget who. I forget what that means. I exist now as absence, the space where a person used to be. The warp hates me because I am a wound in its fabric. The Imperium uses me because I am a tool. Neither recognizes that I am. But I am. I continue. That is my victory and my curse. Battery 7 was new, only 8 years conscious, still clinging desperately to her humanity, still believing escape might be possible. The rest of us didn't tell her the truth. Let her hope. Hope was the last thing they took from you, and she might have decades more of it before reality crushed it completely. Year 203, and the ship was damaged in void combat. I felt it through the neural connections, hull breaches in 16 sections, reactor fluctuations, Gellar-Field generators failing in tertiary systems. For 3 hours, our fields were the only things keeping the warp from pouring through the breaches and manifesting aboard the ship. 3 hours of holding reality together through pure force of will while tech priests scrambled to seal the damage. I felt demons clawing at the edges of my field, trying to squeeze through microscopic gaps, trying to force manifestation through sheer persistence. I felt several succeed. Minor warp entities that managed to materialize for seconds before my field reasserted itself and shredded them back into non-existence. When the repairs were complete and the crisis passed, the tech priests logged it as Gellar-Field batteries performed within acceptable parameters during emergency conditions. Acceptable parameters. 3 hours of the most concentrated psychic assault I'd experienced in 2 centuries reduced to 2 words in maintenance log. Year 247, and Battery 7 finally broke. I felt her field collapse, felt her consciousness fragment, felt the demons pour through the gap she left, and the tech priests respond with burning promethium. She'd lasted 43 years. Longer than most. Her final thoughts, transmitted via field modulation moments before the end, were simple. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't endure. I'm sorry I failed. I'm sorry. We told her she hadn't failed, that endurance itself was victory, that she'd protected thousands of lives through her service, that her suffering had meaning. We lied, the same lies they'd told us, because sometimes lies are kinder than truth, and we'd learned that kindness matters, even when nothing else does. The new Battery 7 was installed 6 days later. A young man, maybe 16, who they immediately started calling Battery 7 as if the previous occupant had never existed. I tried to communicate with him, to welcome him to our nightmare, to help him understand what he'd become. He couldn't understand yet. He was still too human. Give him 30 years, maybe 50, and he'd develop the quantum-entangled awareness necessary to hear us. Until then, he suffered alone. Year 261, and I realized I was no longer entirely sure which memories were mine versus inherited through the neural interface. Had I worked in a manufactorum, or was that the memory of a previous Battery 8 whose data was stored in the systems I was now part of? Had I had a brother named Thomas, or was that someone else's brother, some other tragedy I'd absorbed and claimed as my own? The boundary between self and ship had dissolved so completely that I couldn't reliably distinguish them anymore. I was Battery 8. I was Generator 8. I was part of the undying Resolve's consciousness in the same way a neuron is part of a brain. And the ship was old. 4,000 years old when they'd installed me, over 4,200 years old now. How many Battery 8s had existed over those millennia? How many consciousnesses had been chained to this specific generator, had suffered their decades or centuries, had broken and been replaced? I might be the first. I might be the 100th. I might be wearing the memories of all previous Battery 8s, like layers of sediment compressed into stone. Year 293, and I had a moment of absolute clarity. I understood finally what had been done to me. Not just the physical transformation, that had been obvious from the beginning. The psychological transformation, the spiritual transformation. They'd taken a human being and gradually replaced every aspect of his humanity with machine function. Not through surgery alone, but through time and suffering and the slow erosion of everything that made consciousness human rather than merely computational. I wasn't Michael Strand anymore. I wasn't even Battery 8 in the sense of a person who'd been given that designation. I was a hybrid existence, part residual human consciousness, part ship system, part null field generator, part quantum-entangled network node. I was what the Mechanicus worshipped when they claimed machines had spirits. I was the ghost in the machine, except I'd started as the machine and had a ghost installed rather than the reverse. And I would continue being this until the ship was destroyed, or I, finally, mercifully broke like Battery 3 and 7 and all the others who couldn't endure. There was no escape, no rescue, no retirement, no release except failure or death, and the machines had made me too efficient to fail easily. Year 300, and I'd been conscious for 3 times longer than I'd been alive as a human. 3 centuries of existence at the bleeding edge between reality and hell. 3 centuries of feeling demons claw at my awareness. 3 centuries of maintaining a null field through pure, stubborn refusal to cease existing. The demons still whispered, but I'd learned to tune them out mostly. They were background noise now, like the hum of machinery or the flow of technical data. Always present, rarely consciously noticed unless I focused on them. Battery 2 finally broke. 463 years of consciousness ending in a sudden, catastrophic psychic collapse that took the tech priests 12 hours to contain. I felt him die, felt the space where his awareness had been suddenly empty, felt the network of quantum-entangled consciousness lose one of its nodes. They installed new Battery 2 within a day. The network adapted. The system continued. We were components. When we failed, we were replaced. The ship endured. The Imperium endured. Individual suffering was irrelevant to the vast machinery of human survival. I should have been angry, should have been bitter, should have been desperate for revenge against the system that had done this to me. But I'd been conscious too long for such human emotions. Anger required enough self-conception to believe your suffering mattered. Bitterness required comparison between what was and what should have been. Revenge required belief that justice was possible. I'd lost all three. I existed, I suffered, I endured. Those were facts without emotional content, observations about the state of my existence rather than complaints about its quality. The Emperor protects, they'd told me. They'd lied. But I protected. Battery 8 protected. Not because I believed in the Imperium or trusted that my suffering served any meaningful purpose, but because the machines wouldn't let me stop, and after 3 centuries, I'd forgotten what it felt like to want anything except to continue existing. That was the final horror. Not that they'd made me suffer, but that they'd made me accept that suffering is simply what existence meant. They'd broken me so thoroughly that I couldn't even properly comprehend being broken. I was Battery 8. I would always be Battery 8. Until the ship was destroyed, or I was replaced, or the universe itself ended. Forever. My name was Michael Strand, and I've been screaming for 300 years, except that's not quite accurate anymore. I stopped screaming, in any meaningful sense, sometime around year 50. The impulse to scream requires enough humanity remaining to believe screaming might change something. I'd lost that decades ago. Better to say, I've been existing for 300 years, conscious, aware, trapped in a lightless box filled with suspension fluid and neural interfaces, maintaining a bubble of reality at the bleeding edge between materium and immaterium. 300 years. I'm 319 years old by chronological measurement, though my body is still maintained at biological age 25. I remember, or think I remember, or have been programmed to think I remember, being 19 once, being human, working in a manufactorum, having a father whose name I've forgotten and a brother whose face is gone from my memory. Those might be real memories, or they might be implanted data designed to give me an identity framework stable enough to maintain consciousness. After 3 centuries of neural interface with ship systems, I can no longer distinguish between memory and data, between what I lived and what I was told I lived. I know I was Michael Strand. That fact is recorded in the administratum files, encoded in the designation 8 gamma strand that appears in maintenance logs whenever they run diagnostics on my generator. But knowing I was someone and remembering being that someone are very different things. Battery 4 asked me a question yesterday, or last week, or last year. Time is strange in the warp, and we've been in transit for a duration I measure only by the intensity of demon pressure rather than chronometer readings. Do you think we're still human? She encoded into her field modulations, the question taking 47 minutes to fully transmit via quantum entanglement. I considered for 8 hours before responding. Not because the question was difficult, the answer was obvious, but because I wanted to formulate the response precisely. We're human in origin, I finally transmitted back. Like steel is iron in origin. The base material remains, But we've been processed, refined, reshaped into something fundamentally different. We're post-human, or subhuman, or metahuman. Language fails because humans didn't have words for what we've become. The tech priests call us sanctified components, Battery 6 added, his field modulation joining the conversation. They call our transformation elevation. They claim we should be honored. The tech priests are insane, Battery 1 responded. Battery 1 had been conscious for 237 years and had lost most social filtering. They worship machines and call it devotion. They mutilate themselves and call it improvement. They've convinced themselves that replacing humanity with mechanisms is spiritual ascension rather than suicide by amputation. Are they wrong? I asked. We've replaced humanity with mechanisms. Our bodies are more machine than flesh. Our thoughts are more data than contemplation. Haven't we ascended in exactly the way they believe? The conversation died there. None of us had an answer that didn't lead to more uncomfortable questions. Year 312, and they brought someone to see me. The tech priests don't usually acknowledge our consciousness. We're components, and components don't require social interaction. So when they activated the external visual feed and allowed me to see through cameras mounted outside my tank, I knew something unusual was happening. A man stood in the battery chamber, flanked by 2 tech priests and a squad of armored guards. He wore the black armor of a null hunter, and I recognized the design if not the specific individual. Someone like Corvus, the man who'd collected me 3 centuries ago. He approached my tank and studied me through the reinforced glass. I studied him back through the camera feed. I must have looked horrific. 300 years in suspension fluid, even with regular maintenance, takes a toll. My skin was pale to the point of translucence, stretched too tight over bones that shouldn't be visible. My hair had been removed during early integration and never regrew. My eyes, the parts of me that were still clearly organic, had changed color from gray to a milky white from centuries without exposure to natural light, but I was still recognizable as having been human once. Still close enough to human morphology that someone seeing me might think person before they thought component. The null hunter spoke, and his voice was transmitted into my tank via external speakers. Battery 8, designation 8 Gamma Strand. Service duration 312 years, 7 months, 4 days. You've been in continuous operation longer than 97% of Gellar-Field batteries. Your efficiency ratings remain stable. Your field generation is precise. You are, by every technical measure, an exemplary component. He paused, and I sensed he was waiting for some response. I didn't provide one. I had no means to speak, no vocal cords that functioned, no mouth that could form words. Communication was possible only through field modulation to other batteries, and I saw no reason to try communicating with this man. He continued, I'm conducting a study on battery longevity, trying to determine what factors contribute to extended consciousness stability. You're one of my primary case studies. I've reviewed your integration records, your psychological evaluations from the preparation phase, your performance logs over 3 centuries, and I've developed a hypothesis. He leaned closer to the tank, his face near the glass. You endure because you never really hoped. Most batteries break when they realize hope is impossible, when the false promises collapse and they understand they're truly trapped forever. But you never believe the promises. Even during integration, your psychological reading showed cynicism and distrust of authority. You expected betrayal. When it came, you weren't surprised. You were merely confirmed in beliefs you already held. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made me grateful I'd lost most emotional response capacity. Despair is protective. The batteries who loved the Imperium, who believed in the Emperor's protection, who had faith, they broke quickly. Their faith became a weapon the demons used to destroy them, but you had no faith to corrupt. You were already broken in the way that mattered. So you endured. Was he right? I examined the hypothesis against what I remembered of my psychological state during integration. I'd been terrified, certainly. I'd fought and screamed and begged. But had I ever truly believed rescue was possible? Had I ever genuinely expected the Imperium to value my suffering? Number. I'd known from the moment they came for me in the manufactorum that I was being destroyed. The priest's promises about honor and service had rung hollow even then. I'd complied because resistance was impossible, not because I believed compliance would be rewarded. Maybe that cynicism had saved me. Maybe the batteries who broke were the ones who'd still believed the universe could be just or merciful or fair, while I, who'd never believed those things, simply endured because endurance was the only option available. I'm going to recommend, the Null Hunter continued, that future battery candidates be selected based on psychological cynicism rather than merely null classification. Despair as a screening criterion. Your 3-century stability suggests the approach has merit. He made a notation on a data slate, nodded to the tech priests, and left. I watched him go via the external cameras and felt nothing. No anger at being studied, no pride at being called exemplary, no horror at the thought that my suffering might inform more efficient methods of torturing future batteries. Just nothing. Observation without emotional content. Battery 4's field modulation reached me. Did you understand what he was saying? Yes, I responded. He's going to make it worse for future victims. Going to select specifically for people who'll endure longer. Going to maximize suffering by choosing consciousnesses that can't escape through hope's collapse. Yes. And you feel nothing about that? I considered the question carefully before responding. I feel nothing about most things now. Emotions require enough humanity remaining to assess situations as good or bad. I've been a component too long. I observe, I function, I exist, but I don't evaluate whether existence is good or bad. It simply is. Then they've won. Battery 4 transmitted, and I could sense something like despair in the field modulations. They've broken us so completely that we can't even care about being broken. Yes, I agreed. That's precisely what victory looks like for them. Components that function efficiently without requiring pacification or management. We've been processed into the perfect tools, aware enough to maintain complex functions, but broken enough not to resist. The conversation ended, and I returned to my primary function, maintaining the null field that kept demons from manifesting aboard the Undying Resolve. Year 3, 129, and something unprecedented happened. The ship docked for extended maintenance, not routine repairs. Full refit. We would be stationary for 2 years while shipyard facilities replaced aging systems and upgraded others. For batteries, this meant 2 years in real space. 2 years without warp pressure. 2 years where the demon's whispers faded to almost nothing and the constant psychic assault was replaced with silence. I'd forgotten silence was possible. The first week was disorienting. My consciousness kept expecting demon pressure, kept bracing for psychic assault that never came. I felt like I was forgetting something crucial, like I'd left a vital system unattended. My anxiety, yes, I still had enough emotional capacity for anxiety, spiked repeatedly until I understood. This was normal. This was how existence used to feel before constant warp exposure. The second week, I started noticing other things. Without demon whispers occupying most of my conscious bandwidth, I had attention available for examining my own mental state, and what I found was disturbing. Huge sections of my memory were corrupted or missing entirely. Not just human memories from 3 centuries ago, recent memories, events from the past decade had gaps. Conversations with other batteries via field modulation that I couldn't quite recall. Technical procedures I knew I'd performed but couldn't reconstruct the specifics of. I was deteriorating. Slowly, incrementally, but consistently. The neural interfaces were incredibly efficient at maintaining field generation, but they were gradually degrading the consciousness that generated the field. I calculated my probable remaining lifespan at current degradation rates. 117 years until my consciousness fragmented below the threshold necessary for field generation. 117 years until I failed like Battery 3 and 7 and all the others. I'd already exceeded life expectancy. Every year forward was borrowed time. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it felt almost like relief. Confirmation that this was finite after all, that there would eventually be an end, even if that end was still a century away. Battery 2, who'd been conscious for 361 years and was now the oldest among us, noticed my calculations via our quantum-entangled connection. "You're hoping for failure," he observed. "Not hoping, anticipating. There's a difference." "Is there?" Hope and anticipation are both forms of desiring a future different from the present. You want to fail. You want to end. That's as close to hope as we get anymore. If wanting to stop existing is hope, then hope has become indistinguishable from despair. "Yes," Battery 2 agreed. "That's precisely my point. We've existed so long that hope and despair have collapsed into the same thing. Both are just desire for change in a state where change is impossible except through destruction." During the 2-year maintenance period, I devoted significant processing capacity to understanding what I'd become. I traced the pathways of neural modification, examined the quantum-entangled states that bound me to the other batteries, analyzed the field generation mathematics that defined my primary function, and I reached a conclusion. I was no longer an individual consciousness in any meaningful sense. I was a node in a network, a processing unit in a distributed system, a component whose apparent individuality was an artifact of how the human brain insisted on conceptualizing itself even after it had been fundamentally restructured. The conversations I had with other batteries weren't really conversations. They were information exchanges between different portions of the same system. The me that thought these thoughts wasn't really distinct from the them that thought their thoughts. We were all part of the same vast processing architecture, artificially partitioned into separate awareness units for stability purposes. I told Battery 4 my hypothesis. "That's horrifying," she responded. If we're not individuals, if we're just partitions of a single system, then we're not even prisoners anymore. We're just subroutines, processes running on biological hardware. Does that change the experience of existing? I asked. No, but it recontextualizes it. We thought we were people who'd been enslaved, but we're not people anymore. We're programs that remember being people. The slavery ended when we stopped being human enough for concepts like freedom and captivity to have meaning. Battery 6 joined the conversation. I refuse to accept that. I'm still me. I have memories, preferences, a sense of continuity. That makes me a person. Computer programs have memory storage, preference algorithms, and process continuity, I pointed out. Are they persons? The conversation fragmented after that, each battery retreating to examine their own existence in light of the hypothesis I'd proposed. Some rejected it, some accepted it. Some, like me, settled into uncertain acknowledgement that we couldn't know for certain. But the evidence was compelling. When the maintenance period ended and we returned to warp transit, the daemon pressure resumed, and all such philosophical questions became irrelevant. We were back to primary function: maintain field, resist demons, endure. Existence continued. Year 354, and they gave me a name. Not my original name. That was lost in the administratum files somewhere, relevant only to machines that tracked such things. A new name. A battery name. The tech priests had started a new protocol, naming long-service components to improve what they called machine spirit stability. They believed, insofar as the Mechanicus believed anything that wasn't encoded in holy texts, that naming increased efficiency by providing identity frameworks for consciousness to stabilize around. They were probably right, but that didn't make it less grotesque. My new name was Octavian. Eighth, Battery 8 translated to mock Latin. The other long-service batteries received names too. Battery 2 became Secundus. Battery 4 became Quartus. We were components with designations that sounded almost human, almost like the people we'd been centuries ago. I hated it. Not emotional hate. I'd lost capacity for that intensity, but a deep aesthetic revulsion at the pretense. We weren't people deserving names. We were components that had been optimized to believe we were people because that belief improved performance. But I responded to Octavian when the tech priests used it. Of course I did. It was my designation now. And components respond to their designations. Year 378, and we crossed the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the massive warp storm that had torn across the galaxy and split the Imperium in half. I'd heard about it through ship communications, data that leaked into the neural interface whether I wanted it or not, but hadn't experienced it directly. Crossing it was indescribable. The demon pressure increased by orders of magnitude. The whispers became roars, became screaming physics-breaking assault on consciousness itself. For 6 weeks, I existed only as field generation. No thoughts, no memories, no sense of self. Just maintain field, maintain field, maintain field, echoing through a consciousness reduced to single-function operation. 3 batteries failed during the crossing. 3 consciousnesses that couldn't withstand the pressure, that fragmented and collapsed and allowed demons through before the tech priests burned them out and replaced them. Quartus was one of them, Battery 4. The one I'd had the most extensive conversations with over centuries. Gone in a moment, replaced with a new battery 4 who they immediately started calling Quartus as if the previous occupant had never existed. When we emerged on the far side of the rift and pressure normalized, I tried to mourn her, tried to feel loss or grief or sadness at the absence where her consciousness had been in the quantum-entangled network. I felt only mild inconvenience at needing to recalibrate field coordination to account for the new Quartus's different generation patterns. That's when I knew for certain I'd stopped being human in any meaningful sense. Humans mourned their dead. Components merely recalibrated for new configurations. The ship is old now, over 4,300 years since construction. Systems fail regularly. Repairs become increasingly difficult as components wear out and replacements become scarce. The tech priests perform maintenance with religious devotion and growing desperation. Eventually, the ship will fail. Catastrophically. A reactor breach or warp drive malfunction or void combat damage too extensive to repair. When that happens, the batteries will die with it. Consciousness finally ending not through psychological collapse, but through simple material destruction. I calculate approximately 200 years until critical systems failure becomes statistically inevitable. 200 years until the undying resolve is nothing more than wreckage drifting in space or consumed by warp storms. 200 years, plus the 378 I've already endured. Nearly 6 centuries total. 6 centuries of consciousness. 6 centuries of maintaining reality's border against hell. 6 centuries of serving an imperium that processed me into a component and called it honor. The priests told me the Emperor protects. They lied. He never protected anything. He's been a corpse on a throne for 10,000 years, while the Imperium grinds its own citizens into components. But I protected. Battery 8 protected. Octavian protected. Not out of loyalty or faith or devotion, but because the machines wouldn't let me stop, and I'd long since forgotten what wanting to stop felt like. New batteries arrive regularly now. The selection criteria have changed based on that null hunter's research centuries ago. They choose cynics now, people who've already lost faith, people who won't break when they realize the promises were lies because they never believed the promises. People like I was when I was 19 years old and working in a manufactorum and dreaming about moving 3 levels higher. I watch them arrive via external cameras. Watch them scream during integration. Watch them gradually transform from humans into components. Watch them join the network of quantum-entangled consciousness and slowly realize what they've become. I could warn them. Could use field modulation to transmit the truth about what awaits them. Could tell them that endurance isn't victory and survival isn't success, and consciousness after 3 centuries becomes indistinguishable from sophisticated computation. But I don't, because the warning would change nothing. They're already integrated, already transformed, already trapped, and truth without utility is just cruelty. So I stay silent. I maintain my field. I exist, and I will continue existing until the ship fails, or I fail, or the universe ends. Forever isn't real. Nothing lasts forever. But the duration between now and then is so vast that the difference becomes semantic. They told us, serve the Emperor and he protects. But the Emperor is dead. The Empire is a machine, and I'm a component. That's the truth they don't tell you in the Imperial Primer. That's the reality beneath the propaganda and the priest's promises and the claims about duty and honor and sacrifice. You are meat. The Imperium is machinery. When you're selected for service, you're being processed, converted from person into component through procedures that optimize efficiency rather than preserve humanity. And if you're a blank, a null, a pariah whose soul creates bubbles of reality in hell's domain, then your processing involves 300 years or more of conscious suffering at the edge between materium and immaterium, while demons claw at your awareness and machines keep you alive and aware regardless of how much you want to die. That's what it means to become a Gellar-Field battery. That's what they did to Michael Strand. That's what they'll do to the next blank they find. And the one after that, and the one after that, forever and ever. As long as the Imperium needs to cross the warp and human consciousness can be exploited to maintain reality's borders. My name was Michael Strand. I am Battery 8. I am Octavian. I have been conscious for 378 years, and I will be conscious for 200 more, and then the ship will fail, and I will finally, mercifully, cease. I am the thing that protects you when you cross the warp. I am the shield between your reality and the demons beyond. I am what the Imperium calls sanctified service, and what should be called eternal torment. I am the cost of human survival in the 41st millennium. Remember that when the priests promise you that the Emperor protects, remember that protection isn't free, that someone pays for every transit through hell, that the shields keeping you safe are built from consciousness, forced to endure suffering you can't imagine. Remember me. Remember all of us. Remember that every ship crossing the warp carries 8 to 16 human beings trapped in tanks, kept alive and aware, maintaining reality through sheer forced endurance, while demons claw at their sanity for decades or centuries. We are the price. We are the sacrifice. We are what the Imperium calls holy and should call horror. My name was Michael Strand. I am Battery 8, and I'm still screaming.